Working for you guys? Everything okay? Great. So I want to start this off by giving credit where credit is due with an acknowledgement. This talk is based on current and extensive work that's being done with Dan Chiappi for the University of California about the phenomenology of rover field work on Mars. This talk is going towards a paper we're writing, and I owe a lot to Dan. So I just want that clear. I'm not going to keep referring to him throughout the talk. So this is a blanket acknowledgement all the way through. Okay. So I hope you all know about the, NASA using the rovers, the robots on Mars, Spirit and Opportunity. And I think they're an exemplary case study of the 4E themes, the themes of that are, central, that are for what's called 4E cognitive science, the idea that the cognition is extended, embodied, embedded, and enacted. And the main problem I want to address is how do the scientists with only limited visual and interactional information develop a sense of being on Mars? How can remote, time-delayed vision and interaction create a sense of presence? Because as we're going to see, that's what these scientists report they get. They get a sense of presence. They get a sense of being on Mars. Now, this case study suggests that the propositional theoretical knowing of Mars, the scientific work on Mars, depends on procedural fieldwork skills, which in turn depend on perspectival abilities to restructure what I'm going to call salience landscaping and sizing up. So the perspectival knowing of what it's like to be on and work on Mars depends on what I'll call a participatory knowing of and through the rover, a way in which the scientists actually identify with the rover in a functional sense. So the seeing as if you're on Mars depends on seeing as if you are the rover. That's what I want to explore. Now, I think this is an exemplary case study because the rovers, of course, send back batch still black and white photos that are significantly time delayed. So it's important to remember throughout the whole of this talk that there is no joystick control of the rovers whatsoever. Okay, that is not the case. Yet, even though there is no such joystick control, all they get are these flat, two-dimensional black and white pictures from Mars. The scientists it's the scientists who are using the rovers that do the science on Mars. The AI on the rovers is totally inadequate to doing anything like science, okay? So notice how this is, this is an amazing case of extended cognition, because it's only the combination of the scientists and the rovers that are actually capable of doing the field work on Mars. Okay, so that's a clear one of the 4 E's. The problem is the other E's are deeply challenged by this case study. Well, why? Well, let's talk about enactment. The sensory motor loop is really delayed. It is really delayed, and its connection to action is completely displaced. Secondly, there's a wrench also thrown into embodiment, since the robot's body is not a human body, and it's not in the same environment as the human being. So both embodiment and embeddedness are being challenged. So although we clearly have extended mind, it looks like we shouldn't have, enaction, embodiment, or embeddedness. Okay. However, for all of this problematization, the scientists regularly and reliably report 2 related phenomenological features. They report a sense of being on Mars, like I sense that I'm in my room right now. And they report then that sense of presence is bound up with seeing as the rover. They have a phenomenological sense that they're seeing as if they're the rover. Now, this ability, these 2 phenomenological features are not just sort of weird, epiphenomena over here. These abilities are highly sought after. The scientists report that they look for people when they're trying to recruit people into their team. They look for people who can generate this sense of presence since it gives them the needed situational awareness, please remember that, situational awareness, to do the field work on Mars. If you can't get this flip in your head where you're on Mars and you're seeing as the rover, you just will never be good at doing the field work. So acquiring and applying the skills of the field work actually requires this perspectival situational awareness and this participatory identification. So here is the central problem. Given how disrupted standard 4E features are, how is it that scientists nevertheless seem to acquire the phenomenological markers of embeddedness in action and, as we shall see, embodiment? That's the central question I'm going to try. And now I don't have like a finished answer, because if I did, the paper would be written. But I want to give you the argument as it stands right now that, that Dan and I have been formulating. Okay, so we have a lot of psychological work on the sense of presence since the rise of virtual games and environment. There's been a lot of psychological work done on this because the sense of presence is highly sought after in virtual environments. Okay, so this is a feature that people are really looking for in the design of these virtual environments. Now, I don't have the time, and I don't know if it'll be that useful right now. I'm not attempting to summarize all this work or give some exhaustive analytical definition of the sense of presence. What I want to do instead is draw out some key features that I think will be necessary for the rest of this talk. Okay, so as I mentioned, sense of presence is a sense of being there. It has an indexical quality to it. It is an active indexical sense of here-nowness in some environment. I'm here now in my room, okay? That's why it's often expressed as being in or on X. That's why the scientists talk about being on Mars, okay? That's how it's expressed. Now, one important consequence of a sense of presence is a sense of realness. People often will, in fact, if you're reading the ethnographic descriptions of people in virtual realities get a sense of presence, they will often interchange language about being there with it being real. They are exchanged freely and frequently. Presence makes the experience real. Now, I know there's philosophers present, and I have training in philosophy, so I know that's a completely contested word. So what I'm using that word to report here is a sense rather than making an ontological reference to reality, whatever that is. I'm using realness to refer to this phenomenological feature in contrast to, I'll use the word reality if I want to make any ontological claims. Okay. Now, what's still nevertheless important is that the sense of realness is normative for us. We experience it as good. We go, yeah, that's good. We intuitively understand why people seek it out. Like when people say, wow, I had a real sense of presence in that video game, we don't go, why would you want such a thing? We just go, yeah, wow, yeah, it's great when that happens, right? We experience it as rewarding. It's pleasurable. It'll motivate us to re-engage with that virtual environment reliably if we get a sense of presence and realness out of it, such that it's plausible that this sense of presence and realness is an evolutionary marker that's guiding behavior in some fashion. So it's doing some important cognitive work, I think, is a reasonable hypothesis. Okay, so two questions, therefore, immediately arise. What is it about presence that is generating this sense of realness in a way that functionally makes sense? And so why, and that is to then ask the next question, why does it have this normative value for us? Now, one common sense intuition that many people bring to the sense of presence is that people often express that presence is generated by verisimilitude. Verisimilitude is how you generate presence. Now, this makes sense because I suggest that this intuition is exactly an attempt to co-explain the sense of presence and the sense of realness, since verisimilitude could potentially generate both of these senses together. Okay, great. However, The only problem with this very intuitively plausible proposal is it's probably not the case. And that's one of the wonderful things about science, is it often challenges our common sense intuitions. Why does it appear not to be the case? Because VR research has shown that one can have verisimilitude without a sense of presence, and one can have a sense of presence in games such as Tetris that have very low degrees of verisimilitude. The sense of presence in Tetris gets so great that people start dreaming in Tetris world, which is a bizarre and strange thing, okay? So this last feature strongly suggests that the sense of presence precedes, in causation, I don't mean in normal phenomenology, the sense of realness. Okay. So the Tetris phenomena points to intense involvement as perhaps a better hypothesis for generating the sense of presence. Perhaps what's going on, what generates a sense of presence, is a sense of intense involvement, because that's surely the case in Tetris, especially when people seem to be, reporting it's so real to me, etc. So one of my former students and somebody I'm working with right now, Gary Hove-Hennison et al. In 2019, they published an article on this, and they drew on this lack of verisimilitude, the sense of involvement, and work that I myself and Leo Ferraro and Aria Hara-Bennett have published in 2018 on the nature of flow, to argue that it's the ability to generate the flow experience that is what creates the sense of presence. So the flow experience, it has been studied extensively. It was made famous by Csikszentmihalyi. That's how you pronounce that series of letters, Csikszentmihalyi, in 1990 in his book entitled Flow. And the flow experience is the experience where, like, as people talk about it, you're in the zone, you feel tremendously at one with your environment. Please remember that. You feel tremendously at one with your environment. Things seem super salient. Although you're aware of high metabolic arousal, the behavior seems effortless, time seems to pass differently, etc. It's a deeply rewarding. So it's an optimal experience in two senses for people. Many people regard it as the greatest experiences they can have in their life. And in fact, there's good research showing that the flow experience is predictive. And the more often you flow in your life, the more well-being you will have, and the more meaningful you will find your life to be. So it's optimal in that sense, but flow is also optimal in the sense that it affords optimal performance. People are often performing at their very best. So it's a great experience. It rewards, it motivates, it facilitates skill development and application. It's intense involvement. This looks like a really good potential candidate. Now, it's clear that this is an excellent explanation, I think, that Gary's done for video games, because video games are domains in which people reliably report a sense of presence, and video games are one of the most reliable techniques we have for generating the flow experience. So people reliably report both a sense of presence in video games and the flow experience. So this is an excellent proposal, I think, for the virtual world of video games. However, for all of its promise, flow brings us back to the problem which we're originally addressing. I don't think flow is going to work for us here. Why? Csikszentmihalyi argues that in order to trigger the flow state, the interaction with the environment has to have three features. These are three necessary features. There has to be clear feedback of information, which you get in video games, of course. There has to be a tight coupling between your actions and the results of your actions. So that a tight causal temporal coupling. And error is diagnostic. That means that failure disrupts performance in an obvious and powerful way, which of course, in a video game, you die, stuff like that, okay? So you can think about how video games have this. They give you this clear, right, information. There's all kinds of rules. You get clear feedback. There's a tight coupling between your actions and what's happening in the virtual environment, and failure is diagnostic. Now, while error is diagnostic with the rover, I think that's reasonable to say that, because if you make a mistake with the rover, it's extremely costly it could destroy the whole mission. So error is diagnostic. So that feature is clearly covered. The problem is the other two features are not. The pictures, which is the feedback that come back from Mars, are often quite ambiguous. They are not clear. They are ambiguous, and they are literally subjected to hours and hours of debate. That comes through in the ethnography. Okay? Also, as I've already mentioned, there is no tight causal temporal coupling between the scientists and the Martian environment via the rovers. It's just not there. So 2 of the 3 necessary features for flow are clearly absent. So we can't, right? So verisimilitude is out and flow are out. However, I do want to point out the fact that within the flow experience, and this is part of the argument that I'm developing and part of the work that I already did with Leo and Arian, right? I think that within the flow experience, within the flow phenomena, there's a more basic phenomena. It's more generalized. It can work, I think, more abstractly in that sense, that might be relevant to the sense of presence and the sense of realness via the rovers. Okay, so this is the notion of optimal grip. It's a notion proposed by Merleau-Ponty, further developed, for example. It's developed by many people. These are just examples. This is not an exhaustive list, but these are people whose work is informative of my work. So it's further developed, for example, by Dreyfus and Taylor in 2015, and Brunenberg and Retval in 2014, etc. Okay. So there's a connection here between, I'm going to argue, between sense of presence and getting this optimal grip. So what is optimal grip? So optimal grip is to dynamically find a balance between trade-off variables, and that finding that dynamical balance in that trade-off affords optimal interaction with the object or situation in a way that is indexically relevant. So let's do a couple of examples of this, because when you're doing phenomenology, it's best to sort of enact some of it. Okay, so one such trade-off is between gestalt and features. So here's some object, right? And so now you're getting some details, right? But you're losing the gestalt. Now you're getting the gestalt, but you're losing the details. And the solution is not a Canadian solution, which is to always compromise and always go to the midpoint between those two extremes. That's not the answer. Why? Because the relative balance between gestalt and features is dependent, indexically dependent on what I'm trying to do in this situation right here, right now. So if I'm trying to use it as a pencil to write on this piece of paper, I'm going to optimally grip it, no pun intended, in a particular way. But if I want to throw it as a projectile, notice how different it is on my visual, right? Everything has changed because now I'm using it different. So my optimal grip is a dynamic trade-off relationship between variables that is always indexically relevant to the task at hand. Okay, that's one kind of trade-off, by the way, gestalt and feature. Mateson, way back when, in a book from 1976 that deserves to be more famous, called Sentience, also talks about a phenomenon that he calls sizing up. We're always sizing up objects, and it's directly relevant, I think, to Merleau-Ponty's notion of optimal grip. But he brings out other trade-off variables. For example, in the way you're optimally gripping this visual situation, there's a trade-off between foreground and background. You're always trading off between them. There's trade-offs between finding salient what is familiar and finding salient what is novel, right? So there's constant trade-offs going there. So try to think about, don't think of trade-off as like a single act, a single balancing act. It's this multi-dimensional complex balancing act between all of these trade-offs. And when you get it right, what you have is an affordance of your ability to interact in the situation. Now, the thing about optimal grip is it can be very abstract in nature. First of all, it's a more basic action or interaction than the flow state, because The idea of an optimal grip is you're doing it everywhere. Your expertise in it is a highly generalized expertise of just being a perceptual cognitive actor. So that's important. But optimal grip can also occur at very abstract levels. Eleanor Rosh's notion of basic categories, the fact that when an animal goes by and you would say, there's a dog, rather than there's a mammal or there's a Cocker Spaniel, is about trying to get an optimal grip between within category similarity and between category dissimilarity. And that varies according to the context. If you're at a dog show, you don't call it a dog, you call it a Cocker Spaniel, etc. Okay, so optimal grip is this very general, but also very primordial phenomena. So it's much more likely, unlike the flow state, that the scientists are making use of it. Okay, so all of this contributes to aspectuality. I'm picking up on a notion from Wittgenstein here in our experience. When I'm optimally gripping, I'm either seeing this as a pencil or seeing this as a projectile or seeing this as something to hold my paper down, etc. Seeing things under a particular aspect, aspectualization. Of course, as I keep emphasizing, this is all unfolding temporally in a way which is also centered on me. So you have aspectuality, centrality, and temporality. That's the acronym ACT, because I'm, of course, trying to indicate that this is an enacted phenomenon. Okay, what this does is it creates a dynamical topography of salient aspects, salient timing, and salient centering. What do we get out of this complex optimal grip sizing up? Is a constantly shifting salience landscape. It's a constantly shifting salience landscape that is fluently affording our interaction with the environment. So this salience landscaping is generating our situational awareness. We have this term situational awareness, but what I'm trying to do is unpack what it means and connect that to what functions are being run at that time. So I want to call this optimal grip sizing up salience landscaping for situational awareness, perspectival knowing. It is knowing what it is like to be here and now through both senses of the word, beyond and by means of, through one's current state of mind. So my salience landscape, for example, of this room changes when I'm drunk as compared to when I'm sober, for example. Because my optimal gripping, my salience landscaping, all of that's going to shift around significantly. So what is my claim? My claim is that the sense of presence is not being generated by verisimilitude or by flow, is that the sense of presence is the phenomenological feel and marker for a perspectival knowing. Okay, so all of that has only just reformulated and extended the question. So how do the scientists generate perspectival knowing through the rovers while dealing with displacement and delay? How do they do that? Okay, so Vervaeke in a 2012 paper, and more recently in this wonderful ethnography, Seeing Like a Rover, really unpacks this. I was going to use, but I don't have time. There's another good ethnography. I think the Vervaeke is more central to this talk, but Clancy's Working on Mars is also very, very good. So she talks, let's go back to the scientist getting these photos. She talks about this very complex process she calls drawing as, and it is deliberately, right? She's deliberately alluding to Wittgenstein's seeing as, drawing as. Now, what does she mean by drawing as? She means that the scientists are drawing on the photos. They draw on the photos. They put lines on the photos. They put markings. They put words. They put arrows. They put dots. They put colors. They do all of this stuff. So they're drawing on the photos, but they're also drawing out what needs to be seen. That's what drawing as means. It means drawing on and drawing out. It's aspectualization. So This drawing as is a process by which the scientists take the raw photos and they process in order to be able to generate seeing as. They want to aspectualize. Now in meetings, they're doing this in meetings and they're constantly creating a shared narrative of the movement of the rover. So they're creating this shared temporality. And they're always doing this keeping in mind the energetic and mechanical limits of the rover, their centrality. Because if they don't keep centering everything as relevant to the bioeconomy of the rover, they screwed, because they can kill the rover or it will die, because it's always precarious. Now, the scientists do generate those famous panoramic pictures that we see. There was one a couple of weeks ago, which is really a nice gift for my talk, right? Oh, look, new pictures from Mars. And we all go, oh, that's wonderful, right? And they do create a verisimilitude sense of presence. And here's what you need to know. That's all for public consumption. Those photos are pretty much useless for the scientists. They're pretty much useless. They are not what is generating the sense for the scientists of being on Mars. They're designed primarily to raise public funding. Okay, so the kind of presence that those pictures might be generating is what it's like to be a human, actually what it's like to be an American on Mars. If I can speak as a Canadian here, because there's lots of talk about, we'll push the rover so it gets a sense of an open frontier and lots to explore. It's okay, I get that, all right? But see, that's not what we need. To do the work on Mars, you need to know what it's like to be a rover on Mars. The needed seeing as is seeing as a rover, in this sense, seeing like a rover. So, as I mentioned, the second way they're processing the photos, which generates the second kind of presence, the presence that actually makes the scientists feel like they're on Mars, there's extensive manipulation of salience. They're doing literal external salience landscaping. They're adding colors, words, lines, arrows. This salience manipulation is toggling between trade-off variables until they get sort of a pop-out experience, or they get a realization, oh, that's stratification. That potentially indicates erosion. We should look there. There might be water, evidence that water was there. So drawing as is external. I mean external to, right? It's not happening in your visual processing. That's what I mean by external. Drawing as is external salience landscaping. And it gives the second sense of presence that affords one doing the field work through the rovers. As I want to keep reminding you, this is highly sought after, this ability, because it affords doing good field work on Mars. You can see why, because this ability to generate the sense of presence gives you these pop-out experiences, gives you these realizations, gives you this enacted situational awareness that affords doing good field work. Now, as the title of her book indicates, Vervaeke was really interested in how the sense of presence is created. And what she notes is so I'm going to slow down here a little bit, because this is where it gets really, wow. Okay, she notes a reciprocal process of identification that helped to develop this second sense of presence. It's generated through a set of practices. So one set of practices she notes is the scientists engage in anthropomorphizing. The robots, the rovers are anthropomorphized, but in a very particular way. The scientists will say things like, I need to go here for moving the robot. And it's, I need to go here, I need to move my eyes, manipulate my arm, my fingers need to be manipulated. And the rover needs to sleep and wake up, and it looks and it talks to Earth. However, there's much more than anthropomorphization at work. Vervaeke also talks about the scientists do the reverse, which she calls, they technomorphize themselves in order to see like the rover. Scientists will try to enact this technomorphic identity. This is from the 2012 paper. Here's one of the scientists, and she picks up her phone. You can see it's a little bit aged. It's a flip phone, but nevertheless, she picks up her phone, she puts it, and she says, like, these are my cameras, right? And she's on a chair with wheels, and she says, I need to sort of wheel around, and I need to pivot this way in order, right, to get the view we need. So notice you've got this loop of the reciprocal shaping of identity. You're anthropomorphizing the rovers, but you're technomorphizing the humans. So there's an enacted integration of knowing oneself through the rover, knowing the rover through oneself, so that one is simultaneously knowing oneself, knowing the rover, and knowing through the rover. There's a dynamic mutual shaping that is analogous to how organisms and environment dynamically mutually shape each other in niche construction, and how culture is also the mutual shaping of people and environment. I would like to name this cognitive, visual, enactive, mutual shaping into being at home in a particular environment. I want to call that participatory knowing. Participatory knowing. It's knowing by participating in this process of the mutual shaping of identity, this mutual fittedness. Now, I want to emphasize how deep this participatory knowing goes with a series of quotes from Vervaeke 2012, but also quotes from 2015. I need to read these out because the literal quotes are really important for making my argument. The first quote comes from the person we just saw a few minutes ago who was enacting, right, that picture. She says, my body, by the way, is always the rover. Wow, look at that sentence. My body, by the way, is always the rover. So right here is the front of the rover. My magnets are right here. And my shoulders are the front of the solar panel. And that's, and she does this, that's the rest of it. So I have all kinds of things stepping up over there. And then she laughs. But when I'm taking a picture of something in the atmosphere, then it helps me to kind of look up. She does this, right? Being the rover. And this is the front of me. And then I put my head up and it looks back and forth, right? Wherever to whichever vector I'm looking at. Another scientist had this to say. This is where it gets freaky, guys, so hang on, okay? I was working in the garden. These are rocket scientists. I was working in the garden one day, and all of a sudden, I don't know what's going on with my right wrist. I cannot move it. Out of nowhere, I get here to the planning meeting, and Spirit, that's one of the rovers, has its right front wheel stuck. Things like that, you know? I'm totally connected to Spirit. Another scientist said something similar. Interestingly, I screwed up my shoulder and needed surgery on it right about that time that Opportunity's IDD, its arm, started having problems with the stiff shoulder joint. And I broke my right toe before Spirit's wheel broke. So I'm just saying, maybe it's kind of sympathetic. I don't know. I mean, I don't think there's any magic involved or anything, but maybe it's some kind of subconscious thing. I don't know. Vervaeke then reports that this, quote, body work is certainly intimately, notice the language, it's very strong, right? This body work is certainly intimately associated with visualization practices and interpretive skills. So it's important to note that researchers perform, as I said, I keep saying, researchers perform all kinds of manipulations of the pictures, drawing as, that reduce verisimilitude in order to alter salience in such a way as to trigger this participatory knowing, because this participatory knowing affords the sense of presence, and then the sense of presence affords the situational awareness that trains the procedural skills of field work. And you can't do the science, generate the theory, until you can do the field work. I am proposing to you an order of dependence. The propositional theoretical knowledge is dependent on procedural knowing how to use the rover in field work. which is in turn dependent on the perspectival knowing, that salience landscaping, the situational awareness, that second sense of presence, that is in turn dependent on participatory knowing, being on Mars by being the rover. The theory depends on skills, which depend on seeing as, which depend on seeing as the rover by reciprocally identifying with it. This is done mostly implicitly and tacitly. This is actually an exemplary case of 4E cognitive science. Seeing as depends on seeing as the rover, seeing like the rover, through perspectival and participatory knowing that generates presence and realness in how one does virtual science by being virtually on Mars. Thank you very much, everyone.